to kind of the beginning of this year, I was a nuclear regulator. So I was kind of doing the very operational facing role with kind of the nuclear sector, looking at securing kind of environmental compliance. And since then, I've kind of moved into a more of an advisory role, which kind of I'm looking more at kind of policy and strategy to do with radioactive substances regulation in a kind of wider sense. So the reason I was nominated by my line manager to do this presentation is one of the things that I've been looking at in my role is kind of how that we ensure that we regulate with sustainability in mind. So we're an environmental regulator. Obviously, we're focused on protecting the environment, but it's really important that we ensure that we regulate in a really integrated way so that we are not driving any kind of perverse behaviours with the sectors and the organisations that we regulate. And that we're really making sure that when we're regulating, we're looking at an integrated view of environmental protection so that we're not kind of solely driven by the impacts of radioactive waste in kind of the impacts of radioactivity in the environment, that we're looking at kind of that much more holistic, wider view of environmental protection when we're going out to sites and doing our regulation. So I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of aspect of work as we kind of go through. But I thought a good place to start is to kind of think, why have I been asked to come and talk about sustainability? And kind of that word has got such currency at the moment and everyone's talking about it. It's being brought into everyone's branding. There's a heck of a lot of what I would call greenwashing going on out there because but the reason for that is kind of the context is the world that we live in at the moment is quite a challenging one. So the world we live in at the moment, we're now facing 3 environmental emergencies. So it's not just climate change, we're also facing an emergency on biodiversity loss and also an emergency in terms of the levels of pollution that we're seeing across the environment. And there's a really good report that's been released recently, which is this one by the United Nations Environment Programme, which is called Making Peace with Nature. And it's a really good report. It kind of brings together a lot of different global assessments, and it kind of just articulates quite well kind of the place that we've got ourselves into with the current way that we live. And it kind of really reflects on the fact that we're really on a precipice at the moment, and we're really at a point where if we don't take action, nature and the earth and the natural resources that we rely on won't be able to support human society. They will not be able to provide for us any longer, and we will not be able to live the lives that we live. So I just thought in terms of a sobering reminder of kind of where we're at, this is why we're talking about environmental protection. This is why we're talking about sustainability. And this is why we need to look to kind of transform our social, our economic systems, improve our relationship with nature, and kind of we need to look to understand the value that nature brings. And we need to bring all of that right into the heart of our decision making. So the report is quite stark. It kind of really lays out the gravity of the situation. I'll just read to you kind of the 2 headlines that stick out to me, which is that unsustainable development is rapidly degrading Earth's capacity to sustain human well-being, and the world is failing to meet its commitments to limit environmental damage. So that's where we're at, and that's why we're talking about sustainability, because if we don't do something, we don't take action, the earth and the world will no longer be able to support the way that we live. So it's kind of non-negotiable, really. The report is also quite positive, and it kind of recognises that there is an opportunity to take action, and there is kind of, if we look to address those environmental emergencies kind of together in an integrated way, we do have the ability with kind of society, community, technology, human ingenuity, we do have the ability to kind of make a turning point in this state of affairs that we've got ourselves into. So that is all kind of well and good, but kind of the solution lies, when people talk about this, they say solution lies in sustainability and sustainable development, but kind of what do we really mean when we say sustainability? It's quite a difficult concept for a lot of people to kind of get their head around, and to kind of, when we're talking about this, we're talking about like a fundamental shift in the way that we think. So I will just read to you a couple of definitions that exist, and maybe one of them will resonate. So the most commonly used one is one that came from the United Nations Brundtland Commission, which is the most commonly used one, which talks about that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's how we've got to act. That's one. Another would be that sustainability refers to the capacity for Earth's biosphere and human civilization to coexist. Or sustainability simply might mean enduring into the long-term future. And kind of all of those are equally valid, equally relevant. The challenge comes in what we'll go into later in the talk is kind of how we translate those kind of fundamentals into something meaningful and tangible for people and organizations and businesses to kind of act on, and to kind of make it tangible and meaningful for what it is that you're doing and what you're trying to do in a more sustainable way. So for me, kind of the easiest way that I kind of get my head around sustainability is just using kind of the type of picture that's on the screen. And it's basically every definition of sustainability and any kind of ideas around it are all compromised around those three core pillars of kind of life and how we exist in society, which are the social dimension, the economic dimension, and the environmental dimension. And kind of the point of sustainability is kind of finding that sweet spot in the middle where we're valuing kind of all of those things equally. And I think that it would be fair to say that traditionally our kind of concept of value is completely driven by economic and monetary value. And for me, sustainability is looking at kind of how we attribute equivalent value to what the environment provides for us and the kind of equivalent damage that we do to the environment. What value does that detract? And also in terms of like bringing to the fore the value that having kind of healthy, vibrant, people and communities and societies brings to that. Too often I think the economic value has been put before those things at the cost of the environment and at the cost of people's well-being and health. So yeah, for me, kind of the idea about sustainability is all about how we value things and how we change the way that we make decisions to place equivalent value on other things that are not just economic cost. And if you're interested in kind of that idea of value, I would probably point you towards Mark Carney's written a book all about value. So as in the previous governor of the Bank of England. I haven't read it, but I have listened to, he did a quite a good series on BBC Radio 4 that really goes into kind of this idea of value and what is it that we value and why have we created a society that is based on monetary value and how might we shift that kind of economic system. It's quite heavy, so I'd probably, only if you're really interested, maybe go into that, but it's quite good. So another kind of good way about thinking of that kind of idea about value and sustainability is this thing called the donut. So there is a professor of economics called Kate Raworth who has founded something called the Donut Economics Action Lab. And it's basically a kind of model for transforming our kind of economy into something which is more sustainable and kind of transforming the way that we use products, create value all around this idea of the donut. So it's just another model of talking about what we've already spoken about, but it basically says that you're looking at kind of, you've got an inner circle, that's basically your social foundation. So on the inner circle, you've got everything you need for kind of human well-being at a very minimal level. Everyone has what they need within this kind of social foundation. So we've got energy, water, food, health. Below that level, people don't have enough. And that's where we're looking at kind of critical human deprivation. People don't have enough if we go below that social foundation. However, on the kind of outside of that ring, we've got the ecological ceiling, which is the outside of the donut. And that's basically saying that's the kind of limit from what we can take from the environment and the planet and the natural resources. And kind of if we push our consumption on our use and our, you know, our relationship with nature too far, and we take too much, that kind of breaches the ecological ceiling, and then we get kind of critical planetary degradation. So we've gone past it, and you know, the planet is no longer able to support human life. So what the donut kind of model is talking about is finding that kind of sweet spot in the middle where we have a safe and just space for humans to live. So everybody has enough, but we're not taking too much from the planet so that we are degrading its ability to provide for us. So let's try and move into making it a little bit more tangible now from the kind of fundamentals. So globally, kind of the idea of sustainability is encompassed by what is called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that they talk about these as kind of being like a blueprint for humanity. Kind of if we look to meet all of the goals that are set out within the Sustainable Development Goals framework. And each of those goals has got a number of kind of targets and indicators and detail which sits beneath it. If we look to kind of meet all of those, then we will be achieving sustainable development. You know, so I think a fair definition of sustainability would say making progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the really key part of the Sustainable Development Goals is that we're looking at kind of making sure that we consider them in an integrated way. So you can't consider yourself to be making progress towards a particular sustainable development goal if that comes at the cost of another one. So you cannot be looking at kind of decent work and economic growth, and that's great if you're promoting that. But if that comes at the cost of a detrimental impact on climate change, detrimental impact on life below water or land, then that isn't progress in any way. So the main thing about the Sustainable Development Goals and the framework is the ability to try and think about it in a really integrated way, which is really hard. And just as a kind of context, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not bound, like, but they're not underpinned by international law. There's nothing binding about them, but most countries, you know, under the United Nations were part of developing them, and all have made voluntary agreements to make progress towards them. The UK being one of those countries, obviously, and we were at the forefront of negotiating these, and we have made a commitment to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've done a voluntary review recently, which you can read online, which kind of gives a picture and a snapshot of kind of how the UK is doing against those kind of Sustainable Development Goals. And the way that the UK government has we don't have a plan. So if you went online and you looked at kind of UK strategy for sustainable development, you won't find one. The kind of approach that the current government has taken to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is that it's delivered through the Cabinet Office. So the Cabinet Office has responsibility for delivering on these, and it's then the way in which they have said we'll meet them is through like departmental plans. So each government department must establish a plan for their department, which will set out how each department will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, you know, in my role, I've looked at the one for DEFRA and the one for BEIS to kind of get an idea of kind of what they see as their role in this. But that's kind of how it's supposed to be done at a kind of national level. But then lots of organizations are also using this framework. So it provides a really good framework to kind of take the idea of sustainability, kind of look at all of those goals and kind of look at how they map to your organization and kind of the impact that you have, and also kind of the positive, you know, both positive and negative impact that you have on all of those areas. And they're often used by organizations to frame a sustainability strategy or a vision, or kind of they're used as kind of a way of translating sustainability into kind of what it might mean for your business. So they provide a good framework. However, I still think that they still live in that kind of intangible kind of space. It's quite hard to get people to really resonate with something that's so big, and such a big goal as kind of, you know, zero hunger. It's very hard to think about your organization and think, well, what am I going to do to deal with poverty and hunger? So that's the hard bit, is kind of taking that and kind of shifting that into something more tangible for your organization. So I'm just going to take a slight detour, which to talk about kind of the Environment Agency's role about in this, and kind of why I've been doing this work in my current role and why I'm talking to you. So sustainable development is part of the Environment Agency's statutory function. So when we were established under the Environment Act, our statutory duties were set out, and one of which is making a contribution towards attaining the objective of achieving sustainable development. And that's quite rare for organisations to be given that kind of steer in their kind of statutory purpose. So it's really important to us, and it kind of is really embedded in everything that the Environment Agency does in environmental protection, is kind of supposed to be embedded in looking at this wider picture of sustainability. So in terms of our role, and I kind of just wanted to bring this in because in case you kind of encounter your Environment Agency regulators, I don't know the range of organisations that you work for, but you know, if you work for a site that has an environmental permit or organisations have environmental permits for various different things, you might kind of come into contact with us. And at the moment, what we've done is we've kind of translated that statutory duty and kind of we've looked at the sustainable development goals, and we've come together with our kind of 5-year action plan, which is really framed around it's very clear when you read our plan that it's all aimed at kind of meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So one of our goals is all about green growth and a sustainable future. And kind of what I see as my kind of role as a regulator is this aim number 7, which is on your screen, which is basically about like, how do we help others to make good choices? Like, how do we support green growth by like helping and supporting businesses in the communities and those that we engage with through our roles as a regulator or an advisor, to make good choices, to make better choices. So that is kind of framed in a kind of a wider understanding of what we mean by regulation. So I think that we recognise, to meet the kind of goals that we've set out in our Environment Agency Action Plan, we need to use more than just the kind of pure kind of prescriptive regulations, command and control type regulation. To meet those goals, we need to take a much broader view, and in some instances that kind of means a lot more collaborative working, a lot closer working with organisations that we regulate, to try and give people the advice and guidance, to try and support them to kind of move on this journey towards kind of a more sustainable way of working. So this is kind of all just framed in the there was a National Audit Office review on kind of better regulation and kind of how regulators work, and that really recognises the range of tools that are available to regulation. So a lot of what we're talking about in the idea of sustainability isn't going to come from that very prescriptive type regulation. So you're not going to see a permit condition saying you must operate sustainably. You know, it's going to be brought into those wider conversations and those where decision making is taking place. That's kind of where we're interested. In bringing in kind of our advice and our guidance and kind of trying to influence to make change, rather than kind of looking at, you know, setting very prescriptive limits and conditions that require certain things. But that might change in the future and our approach might change. But at the moment, this kind of wider picture on sustainability is definitely reaching into kind of that lighter touch regulation, because we think that that's the most effective way of influencing change here, rather than going in with a really hard kind of prescriptive approach. So on that, we have been working with what is called the Nuclear Industry Liaison Group. So the Nuclear Industry Liaison Group is a forum which has been established for many, many years, where operators of nuclear sites and those who hold nuclear site licenses and environmental permits are able to come together to kind of talk through issues with the environmental regulators. So it's a forum to kind of talk through issues to do with regulation, to do with environmental compliance, and to get that kind of interface with the regulators on kind of things that are changing, how regulations are kind of moving into the future, etc. And one of the things that we have kind of been encouraging and working with the nuclear industry liaison group is to come together to kind of build this vision statement for sustainability. So it's just recently been kind of agreed by all the logos of the organizations that have kind of signed up to it are on the bottom. And they've really worked together to kind of translate kind of this big picture on sustainability into something that kind of is meaningful for the nuclear industry and kind of where it is that they feel like they can make most impact. And I think that their vision, I think it says something like that they want to be an exemplary contributor to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then they've split it into these kind of areas of sustainable future, environment and waste being kind of central, because this group of individuals obviously have that kind of environment bias because they're the people who go to engage with the environmental regulator. Got community support and innovation and growth. So if your organization is signed up to it, obviously you should be able to go internally and find this somewhere, hopefully. If not, I might be able to provide it. I can speak with Richard afterwards if that's something that I can provide. I'll find out from my side if I'm able to do that. But that is kind of a really great example of people coming together to kind of flesh out kind of what it means. What does it mean for us in our sector? Like, how do we bring kind of sustainability to life for the nuclear industry? And that's really challenging when you look at the range of kind of operations that go on with the nuclear industry, because the organizations you've got there span the full life cycle of kind of the nuclear power. You've got kind of new build operators as well as kind of decommissioning operations, and the kind of objectives and the action that they can take will be very different at those different ends of the scale. So it's kind of it's an agreement that meets somewhere in the middle that kind of everyone can get on board with. And I think that it started kind of a really good kind of foundation for a lot of those organizations to go away and think about their own kind of sustainability vision. So I'm just going to start going into kind of some specifics about how I see kind of, which I thought were most relevant to you as quality professionals in terms of how you bring sustainability kind of into your own organizations and the actions that you can take to kind of move towards this place where we want to be, where we're looking at value a bit differently. So I think organizational culture is huge for this. Being able to build a culture and kind of have a cohesive vision about what everyone's working towards and what sustainability means for you and your organization is really, really important. And that kind of setting that out at the beginning of your kind of journey on this will be so key, because if you've got something that you've got agreement on, you know, you can then start to feed that through into everything else that goes on. If you've got this kind of vision and kind of a mandate to do things a certain way, exactly in the same way that kind of a nuclear safety culture is, you know, perpetuated throughout the industry, it's very at the forefront, it's very current in people's minds. People know the way that they're expected to behave in order to keep people safe, particularly, you know, with a particular kind of nuclear safety kind of bias. That's so prevalent and embedded within the industry. What we need to do is we need to kind of get to a place where this idea of sustainability is also embedded within the culture and the vision of an organization. So it's understanding kind of that every action that we take has impact. So what I've shown kind of on this slide is one for the NDA group. So they recently appointed a director of sustainability, and they've been working really hard over the past couple of years to kind of generate what sustainability means for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, and particularly the NDA group as a whole. So all of those organisations who sit within the NDA group. And I think that that's what we're starting to see with all organisations now, is that we're starting to see people come together and kind of try and write down what it means. What's the change that needs to be made to kind of turn that business model into something that's more sustainable? And I think a lot of it is about kind of what I said earlier about, you know, we can't be looking to have a business model that's purely based on the objective of profit. You kind of have to think about what is it that what other value does your organization bring that is not just economic value, and how are you going to get your staff working towards those kind of that vision and kind of values as well. So that's just an example that I've stuck up there because it was the only one I had kind of access to. But again, I would kind of encourage you to kind of do some digging in your own organizations, find out what your organization's sustainability policy is. Have they got a strategy? Have they got a policy? Have they got an action plan? Have they got a vision? What is it that your organization is saying about sustainability? And then it's then for you to take that and then say, well, how do I bring this into my work? How is this going to be embedded in the management systems and the arrangements that are in place? How are we going to ensure that kind of our kind of decision making trees and our kind of mechanisms on which we make decisions really bring into play all of those aspects? You know, there's lots of different things that are brought into kind of decision making. How do we make sure that we're making decisions, you know, with all those things in mind? And obviously that's proportionate to the level of the decision and the kind of outcome that you're trying to look for. You know, we're not expecting kind of, you can't expect kind of a huge kind of range of factors to be considered in a very, very small decision. So proportionality is important as well. But that's kind of one where I feel like everyone has a role to play in driving that culture, and then also looking at how that feeds through to kind of action that's taken and the arrangements that are in place. So this section of my talk might jump around a little bit because they're not necessarily interrelated topics, but we've just got a few to go through. So another area where I thought that your kind of profession would be very, very influential is kind of all of those bases and those models that we talked about kind of for sustainability are all founded on a definite need for a shift from a linear to a circular economy. So when we talk about a linear economy, we're talking about that idea of we take materials from the earth, we make products from them, and then eventually we throw them away. The process is linear, and often the things that we're throwing away don't biodegrade, they don't go back into the earth, they are not a resource that can be used again. And that's kind of that cradle to grave, you know, situation. And it's based on the need for finite resources, which we've talked about right at the beginning. They're running out. So it's no longer a valid economic model. It's no longer valid to talk about kind of that take, make, throw away model because there will be nothing left to take to make with. So the kind of shift that is needed, and it's massively in the design phase, is moving from our kind of linear economy to a circular economy, where we're looking at cradle to cradle. We're looking about keeping things in use, keeping things going round and round. So the circular economy is based on like 3 principles, and all of those are driven by design. So it's all about eliminating waste and pollution from the system, circulating the products through the system and the materials at their highest value, and then regenerating nature. So that kind of cradle to cradle approach is really, really important, and kind of designing waste out of systems and designing systems which allow product life to kind of be retained and continue is super important. And it's kind of very relevant actually to the nuclear industry here, I think, because of asset management, I think is really important to that. So looking after what we've got so that we're not, you know, we're not having to repackage waste ever. You know, that's a super wasteful activity and has many, many consequences beyond those just kind of to do with the actual waste. But if we're designing waste to contain it, it needs to last for the time that it needs to last for. If we're designing waste stores, they need to be designed to last for the length of time that they need to last for, and they need to be designed in a way which at the end of life, how are they going to be repurposed and brought back into our circular economy? And another link that probably I will recommend that Richard pops in for you is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is all about kind of the principles of a circular economy and how you can look to make that transition in your design processes to move from a linear to a circular economy. And I do recognise that this has additional problems for kind of radioactive waste, because if we irradiate things, that obviously makes them very problematic to dispose of. And it also makes them very, very difficult to bring back into the kind of the circle. So I think the main thing here is about how do we prevent it in the first place then? How do we generate systems that don't produce radioactive waste? You know, it's a lot of this stuff on sustainability. You have so much more opportunity to make a difference right at that early design phase. And I think that that's really, really key, is design out the waste. keep things in circulation, look after things well, keep the value of what you've created. And the other kind of fundamental of kind of a circular economy is that the idea of a circular economy is that we're decoupling economic activity from the consumption of resources. So it kind of is about that idea of value again. So if something's being brought round and round the circle, you're kind of not reliant on finite resources to produce economic activity. So on we go. So another kind of area which I think is again really relevant is the idea of kind of sustainable supply chains. So what I've popped on the screen there is it's old data because I couldn't find the most recent data, but that is kind of the percentage impact that the Environment Agency's operations have from the supply chain. So 77% of our carbon impact, 99% of our water consumption impact, and 99% of our waste impact all comes from the supply chain. It's not from ourselves as an organization. So I think that is where it becomes really important to look at how you're going to manage supply chains to ensure that you're not passing or deferring your impact onto others, and you have to take accountability for that impact. And that's absolutely what we're doing at the Environment Agency, and we're really working really hard to kind of drive down our environmental impact through the supply chain. And we're doing that through things like commercial incentives and contractual requirements. So there's a lot of scope here, I think, in recognizing the power of your pound. If you're going to spend money on the supply chain, I think it's absolutely right that you can dictate how you want that money to be spent and how you want those operators to behave and what you want doing. Is totally valid, and it's all about thinking. When you think about your organization's impact, you cannot just think about it in the isolation of the organization that you have, particularly in the nuclear industry where we have really complex contractual arrangements. We've got a huge supply chain which is supporting the sector, and the impact has to be considered in its totality, and it cannot be for kind of us to pass on impact to smaller organizations to other organizations. It has to be that we have to account for where our money is being spent. So there are a lot of ways that you can look to do that, and it's all about how do you influence, engage with the supply chain to kind of make those kinds of changes, and also how do you kind of hold them to account. What is it you're going to do to check that the supply chain that the organizations that you've employed are really delivering on what you've asked for. And I've just popped on the screen there's something called the United Nations Global Compact, which is kind of it's like a framework for kind of sustainable business. And you can kind of go on, and I've seen organizations look to use kind of the UN Global Compact principles within their contractual arrangements to kind of look at, this is what we're expecting of ourselves, and this is what we expect of you as a supplier. So just another couple ones just to finish off. So I think that there's a real place for standards here. There are a few standards that are starting to come out now in kind of the area of sustainability, but I think they're few and far between, and they don't cover the range of things that you would maybe expect them to contain. And I think I would particularly urge a lot of caution when looking at kind of standards around carbon accountancy and carbon offsetting in particular. I think it's a bit of particularly the offsetting market is a bit of a wild west, and I think that when you're looking, if you're looking kind of to take standards and to look for accredited organizations there, you will have to be very, very careful what's being picked there and what kind of organizations are saying about what they can do and what they can accredit. But if you look on the ISO website at the moment, kind of each ISO standard is linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they obviously recognise the kind of the impact that standards can have on kind of driving improved performance in different areas. So I think that I've put a few examples of standards on the area, but kind of ensuring that the relevant standards are being applied and being applied properly is definitely something that can definitely drive change here. And in the same way that they can drive change with us, I think there's a position for kind of nuclear sector to be going towards the ISO bodies or the BSI bodies and saying, we need standards in this area to push for I think there's work going on kind of to do with kind of nuclear industry standards at the moment, trying to bring those together. And, I think we should be saying, well, how are we going to use these standards to drive the kind of broader ambition of sustainability? And if you're ever involved in kind of standard creation, that this is a great opportunity to influence and make a change to kind of what's required of organizations. So I think this is my last one. Which is just about reporting and metrics. I think that there's a real position to play here. And I mentioned it at the beginning. I think there's a lot of greenwash out there. There's a lot of sustainable development wash out there. And I think it's about how do we really hold our organizations to account in terms of what are we reporting on and what are we saying about our organizations, and what are kind of the strategic outcomes that we're working towards, how are we making change, and how are we reporting on progress towards those outcomes. And I think that the reporting and metrics will become increasingly important in terms of demonstrating that your business is kind of fit for, I'm going to come on to this, but like fit for the 21st century, that your business really is taking action on these fundamental issues. So there's a couple of links there. I think the Treasury one on sustainability reporting is pretty, it's mostly just about carbon, water and waste. The KPMG report kind of looks to review kind of what people are looking at in terms of sustainability reporting, and might give kind of good ideas about kind of how you might develop indicators and outcomes that you can look to set for your organization. So I think my main message here is kind of that on sustainability, it's not a new idea. Kind of the concept of sustainability has been around for a really long time, but we're obviously not getting it right. So I think that this isn't just tweaks and changes to how your business is run. It's a fundamental overhaul of what you think, do, act on, exactly like Richard said, on kind of that the government level, on the organizational level, on the individual level. It's really kind of it's a big change that's needed, and it's a real fundamental shift in value, I think, is the main point here. And I've just popped on the screen there, which is a nice quote that I've got from SEPA, which is the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. They have kind of a One Planet Prosperity Plan, and they basically kind of, their strapline here is that in the 21st century and beyond, only those businesses that operate in harmony with our one planet will thrive. And I think that just articulates the issue really well. Your businesses will not be able to operate if you don't look to make a change now. So that's all I've got to say. So if we move on to questions, I'll stop sharing.
Christiana, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. I've not seen any questions being typed in yet, so just encourage people to do that, or we'll possibly use the hands up function as well if it's a little bit quicker for people to